Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, we're diving into a topic that I think is just endlessly fascinating, flying saucers. You sent us some really interesting stuff to dig into, especially excerpts from this 1950s book, The Flying Saucers Are Real. I think the author was Donald Keyhoe, right?
Yeah, Donald Keyhoe.
Yeah.
He's a pretty important figure in all this, actually. He was a former Marine Corps pilot, and then he became like a big-time UFO researcher. His work really shaped how people thought about UFOs back then, even today, I feel.
Right. And you know what gets me? He started as a skeptic. He wasn't just some cook who believed everything he heard, but then he started investigating and ran into all this official denial and, attempts to kind of explain away these sightings that just didn't sit right with him.
Yeah, you have to think about the context, right?
Yeah.
This is the 1950s. The Air Force is basically in the business of debunking UFOs. They're saying, oh, it's just a weather balloon, or you misidentified a plane, that kind of thing.
So basically, nothing to see here, folks. Move along. But Keyhoe wasn't buying it. He thought they were ignoring real evidence, so he started digging deeper.
Exactly. And one of the early cases that really got him going was this thing called the Flying Flapjack incident. The Air Force tried to say that a UFO sighting was actually just a super fast version of the Navy's experimental Flying Flapjack plane.
Wait, the Flying Flapjack? What is that, like some kind of pancake-shaped aircraft?
Yeah, it kind of was. But here's the thing. The Navy was like, nope, not ours. We only had one prototype, and it wasn't even flying at the time.
Whoa. Okay, so that's a pretty big problem for the Air Force's explanation.
Oh, yeah, it definitely raised some eyebrows. And for Keyhoe, it was like one of those early clues that something wasn't quite right with the official story. It kind of set him on a path of uncovering more and more of these cases where the explanations just didn't hold up.
Like a trail of breadcrumbs leading him down the rabbit hole.
Exactly. And, probably the most famous case, and definitely the most tragic, is the Mantell incident. This happened in 1948. Captain Thomas Mantell, a really experienced pilot, dies while he's chasing a UFO. He's on the radio describing this huge metallic object, and then silence. His plane just crashes.
That's the story that I feel like really captured everyone's imagination back then. It was this big mystery, and of course the Air Force said it was a weather balloon. But Keyhoe, he goes and analyzes everything. Wind speeds, how balloons behave, witness statements, the whole 9 yards, and he comes to the conclusion that no way a weather balloon couldn't have done what Mantell and others saw.
Yeah, the Mantell incident was huge because it showed just how far the official explanations would go. Weather balloons were pretty common back then, and everyone knew how they worked. For Keyhoe, for the Air Force to use that as an excuse in such a high-profile case, well, it just looked like a cover-up.
It feels like this is the moment where Keyhoe really commits to investigating UFOs, right? Like, this isn't just a curiosity anymore. He sees the government hiding something, and he feels like he has to find the truth.
Yeah, it becomes more than just flying saucers at that point. It's about holding the powerful accountable. And as he keeps digging, he finds more and more of these stories from people who seem totally believable people with no reason to lie. And their experiences are just getting brushed aside.
It reminds me of that story about Captain Childs and his co-pilot, John Whitted. They were flying a DC-3 over Alabama in, I think it was 1948, and they see this cigar-shaped thing just cruising alongside them. They said it was so fast, so maneuverable, unlike anything they'd ever seen. And get this, there were even reports from the Air Force Base in Georgia saying they saw something similar around the same time.
That Childs-Whitted case is a good one. It wasn't just a quick glance. They saw this thing for a while, long enough to really describe it. And for two experienced pilots to be so wrong about what they saw, plus the radar, it just didn't fit the Air Force's explanation that everyone was just making mistakes.
It's like all these little pieces of a puzzle that don't quite fit together, and Keyhoe's trying to figure out the bigger picture.
Exactly. And then he starts looking into radar tracking, and things get even more interesting.
Okay, so we've got Keyhoe, former pilot, now super into UFOs, and he's looking at all this evidence that seems to point toward, well, aliens, right? Was that even a thing people were considering back then? Like, what was the scientific world saying about all this?
It was a really interesting time, Like, on one hand, it's the start of the space age. Yeah. Sputnik goes up in 57, and everyone's looking at the stars thinking, what else is out there? But then there's the Cold War, and everybody's scared of the Soviets. Like, are they going to nuke us?
So flying saucers, whether they're Soviet tech or something even weirder, they really feed into all that anxiety, huh?
Big time. And Keyhoe, he argues that that's part of why the government was so quick to debunk everything. They didn't want people panicking about a Soviet invasion, or even worse, aliens.
That makes sense, but it's still wild that Keyhoe was open to the alien idea while the government was like, nope, nothing to see here. What was it about the evidence that convinced him? Just the sheer number of sightings, or was there something more specific?
I think Keyhoe was really careful about how he approached everything. He looked at all the explanations, the misidentified planes, the weather balloons, even hoaxes, and he just picked them apart. He'd point out where the logic didn't work or where the technology just wasn't advanced enough back then. He even thought about maybe it was secret U.S. stuff, but he ruled that out too. There were just too many sightings. And the things these objects were doing, it was just too far out there.
So he's like a detective, crossing off all the suspects until he gets to the one that seems the craziest. But what about the Soviet angle? Did he really think they could be behind it?
He didn't rule it out completely, especially with the Cold War going on.
Mhm.
But he said, even if the Soviets somehow had these crazy advanced planes, why would they be flying them around where everyone could see? It didn't make sense strategically.
If it was us, he's saying, we'd be way sneakier.
Hmm.
So, not weather balloons, not hoaxes, not the US, not the Soviets. What's left?
Aliens. That's where the interplanetary hypothesis, as he called it, comes in. Keyhoe basically says, look, I've looked at everything else, and the only thing that makes sense is that these things are coming from other planets.
Wow. That's a huge statement. But how did he back that up? What was his logic?
Well, first, he points to how many sightings there were and how consistent they were all over the world. He said statistically, there's just no way all these people, pilots, military guys, scientists, were all making stuff up or seeing things. And then there's the whole thing about what these objects were doing. The speeds, the way they moved, it was way beyond anything we could build back then.
So he's saying the evidence says these things are real and they're doing things our science can't explain. That's pretty bold, but I can see how he got there.
Totally. And he goes even further. He starts talking about how maybe these extraterrestrials are watching us, studying us. Maybe they're even worried about us because we've got nukes now. He compares it to how we might explore a new planet, cautiously watching from a distance.
That's kind of creepy, but I get it. If we found a planet with intelligent life, wouldn't we want to check them out, see what they're up to?
Exactly. Keyhoe thought maybe that's what they're doing, but with way better tech, so we don't even know they're there. Maybe they're afraid to make contacts because they don't want to freak us out or mess with our development.
It's like they're these shadowy observers taking notes on humanity. It's a pretty wild idea, but it makes you wonder, why are they here? What do they want?
Those are the big questions, right? Keyhoe struggled with those, and people are still debating them today. Are they friendly? Are they just curious? Are they here to take over? We just don't know.
So many possibilities. But like you said before, we only have so much information. We have stories, radar data, and a lot of mysteries.
Keyhoe knew that too. He said we need more research, better science, and for governments to be more open about what they know. He really believed the truth was out there, even if it turned out to be something really strange and maybe scary.
It shows how dedicated he was to finding the truth. He was willing to challenge everyone, even when it made him unpopular. He saw UFOs as more than just weird lights in the sky, but as this huge thing that could change how we see ourselves and our place in the universe.
He was way ahead of his time, and he got people talking about the possibility of alien life, and we're still talking about it today. There's more research now, new discoveries, but the mystery's still there.
Speaking of mysteries, there's that one case Keyhoe investigated that sounds straight out of a movie, The Gorman Dogfight. This Air National Guard pilot, George Gorman, he says he got into a dogfight with a UFO over North Dakota back in '48.
Oh, yeah, the Gorman dogfight. That's a classic. It's interesting because you've got a trained military pilot, someone who knows planes, saying he saw something totally unexplainable. Gorman said it was this bright, white light, no wings, no tail, and it was moving so fast, making these crazy turns, he couldn't keep up.
It does sound like a movie plot, but Gorman was serious about what he saw, and the Air Force, they took him seriously too, even though they said in the end it was just a weather balloon.
Of course they did. But Keyhoe, he wasn't buying it. He said, come on, weather balloons don't move like that. They're slow, predictable, and this thing Gorman saw was zipping around like crazy.
It's another example of Keyhoe doing his homework, looking at the details, and realizing the official story just doesn't add up. And it seems like that kept happening throughout his investigation, right? More and more cases that just didn't fit the explanations.
Absolutely. As he went deeper, he started seeing connections between all these different sightings. He noticed they often had similar descriptions: disc-shaped, cigar-shaped, metallic, super fast, and maneuverable, weird lights.
He was putting the pieces of a puzzle together, trying to figure out the big picture behind all these seemingly random events.
Exactly. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that these flying saucers weren't just random, isolated incidents, but part of something much bigger, something real and potentially really important.
And he wasn't just content with saying, oh, hey, look, UFOs are real, right? He wanted to know why they were here, what their purpose was.
Right. He thought if we could understand that, it could help us understand ourselves and our place in the universe better.
That's deep. It shows that Keyhoe wasn't just interested in the what of UFOs, but also the why. What do they mean for humanity? It's a big question.
It really is. And in a way, Keyhoe started a whole new field of study, what we now call ufology. It's not just about the sightings themselves, but about looking at the science, the politics, the culture, everything connected to UFOs.
And that field is still growing today, right? With new research and new technology, we're able to look at these mysteries in ways Keyhoe probably couldn't have imagined.
For sure. And the public's attitude toward UFOs has changed a lot, too. It's not as taboo to talk about them anymore. More people are open to the idea that we might not be alone in the universe.
It's a really exciting time to be exploring all this, and it all goes back to the work of people like Donald Keyhoe, who dared to think differently and ask the big questions, even when it made them unpopular.
He paved the way, challenged the status quo. He showed us that it's okay to be curious, to question everything, and to be open to the unknown, even if it's a little scary.
He reminded us that the universe is full of amazing things we don't understand yet. What's the thing that stands out most to you from all this?
You know, for me, it's the power of those eyewitness accounts. No matter how much people try to explain them away, there are all these credible people, pilots, military folks, scientists, who saw things they couldn't explain. And when you put all those stories together, it's hard to ignore. It makes you think maybe there's something really extraordinary happening.
It's amazing to think about how relevant Keyhoe's work still is, even after all these years. It's like we're still trying to answer the same questions he was asking back then. UFOs, they haven't gone away, have they?
No, they haven't. And I think that says a lot about the mystery,
Yeah.
but also about how good Keyhoe was at what he did, his writing, his research. He made people think, and he didn't shy away from the big, tough questions, even if they challenged what everyone thought they knew.
And it wasn't just him, right? Weren't there some Air Force reports from around that time that also hinted at something strange going on?
Oh yeah, those reports are really interesting. They give you a look at how even the people trying to debunk UFOs, well, some of them were starting to think, wait a minute, maybe this is real. One report from '53, I think, it actually says that space travel from other solar systems is possible. And it even wonders if maybe these aliens are seeing our nukes and rockets and getting a little nervous.
That's almost exactly what Keyhoe was worried about. So even in the Air Force, some people were thinking, maybe we're not alone and maybe these visitors aren't so friendly.
Right, and it's kind of a contradiction, isn't it? They're telling the public it's all nonsense, but then in their own reports, they're admitting there's a chance some of it could be true.
It makes you think, what else were they talking about behind closed doors? Were they having serious conversations about aliens, making plans in case of an invasion?
That's the mystery. We might never know for sure. But it shows that UFOs, they're not just about lights in the sky. They're about science, politics, culture, how we see ourselves and our place in the universe. It's all connected.
And Keyhoe was right there at the heart of it, making people face those big questions, even when it made them uncomfortable.
He was a real trailblazer. Back then, everyone was supposed to just go along with what they were told. But Keyhoe, he stood up and said, this is real, even if people think I'm crazy.
And look at where we are now. There are so many people, researchers, investigators, all building on what he started. We have better technology, better science, so we can look at UFOs in ways Keyhoe probably never dreamed of.
And people are more open to the idea now, too, that we might not be alone.
It's a really exciting time to be looking into all this. And we owe a lot to people like Donald Keyhoe who weren't afraid to think outside the box,
He showed us it's okay to be curious, to question everything, and to keep an open mind about the things we don't understand.
And he reminded us that the universe is a huge, mysterious place full of things we're just starting to figure out. What's the thing that sticks with you the most from all of this?
It's got to be those eyewitness accounts. No matter how much people try to debunk them, you have all these people, pilots, military, scientists, saying they saw things that just don't make sense. And when you look at all those stories, you start to think maybe something really incredible is going on.
Well said. This deep dive into flying saucers and the work of Donald Keyhoe has been amazing. I think he'd be blown away by how much we've learned about the universe since he wrote his book. But I also think he'd be pushing us to keep digging,
Oh, absolutely. He was always looking for answers. He wanted to know the truth no matter what.
He was ahead of his time, and his work, it still makes us think, question things, and stay open to the possibility that there's so much more out there than we know.
And that's a good thing, right? To keep exploring, to keep learning.
For sure. Well, this deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers, but it's also sparked a whole new sense of wonder. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listener?
Well, if Keyhoe was right, if those flying saucers really were spaceships from other planets, why were they watching us? What was their reason? Just curious. Doing some kind of science project. Or something bigger, something we can't even imagine.
That's a great question. Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. It's been a mind-expanding exploration of UFOs and the legacy of a true pioneer.
It's been a pleasure. Keep looking up, everyone, and keep asking questions.